we're facing with immigration and what are some of our opportunities to do advocacy. So I'll start with the first observation, which is, I think, the most critical, is about our current political moment. One of the observations I've heard from a lot of groups who are preparing for the teach-in and going over the talking points and looking things up, which I'm very thankful for. A lot of them have reached out to me and said, well, there's not very many bills that are listed. There's not a lot of legislation that's on the talking points, or seemingly any bills that are really moving through Congress related to immigration. And I think this is something I say oftentimes when I do advocacy trainings, but is especially relevant for this advocacy day after the teach-in, is that Congress does a lot of things other than pass bills. Actually, the thing that they least do is pass legislation. If you look at just the number of pieces of standalone legislation that have passed in the last several years. So advocacy, when we're doing advocacy, it's important to think about what are the other ways that we're trying to influence Congress, and what are some of the actions that are feasible in the short and medium term sense, while focusing in general on the overall messages that we want to communicate to our representatives and senators. So my hope for today is to talk a little bit about the political moment and then go through some of the issues that we have with immigration, and in the midst of those, highlight some opportunities for change. But as you know, we're going to be on Capitol Hill the day before the midterm elections. But even with the old Congress, the day afterwards, we'll learn what will be happening in January with new representatives or senators, or the same representatives and senators. But it's really important to know that this Congress doesn't end in the beginning of November. So throughout November and the beginning of December, there's going to be significant government funding negotiations, specifically for the Department of Homeland Security. So Congress passed what's called a continuing resolution. So they said, we'll stay at the same funding level, and that'll go through essentially mid-December, and which means that they have to reach some sort of agreement about who they're going to fund and what they're going to fund by the end of the year, certainly. And that gives us, it's both the challenge and an opportunity, because there are a lot of, as I'll be talking about, there's a lot of negative policies that could be funded, as well as some opportunities for gains in these funding negotiations. So the number one thing that should be on your mind when you're talking about immigration is the role that money has in either doing good or doing bad. But money is the most relevant piece, especially in a short-term sense, as we do advocacy on the Hill in November. At the same time, it's important to keep in mind the midterm elections, and you'll be meeting with a variety of offices, some of which on the Senate side maybe aren't even up for re-election, others who might not be in government anymore in January, but the vast majority still will be in Congress. And it's important to help encourage them towards new opportunities in this new Congress. So depending on what happens in the House of Representatives, and also who the committee leadership is, there's a potential for greater oversight of immigration activity, which I'll talk about a little bit in the future. But not only does Congress pass bills, but they also hold hearings and they do investigations into different agencies' activities. And that's something that could happen if there were political will in either the House or the Senate to do so. It could be something where we continue to have more influence over the appropriations process, where more of these humane and just immigration reforms are considered in appropriations. Means the budget process or the funding process. So depending on how we get through November and December, then in the new Congress there might be other opportunities to influence funding. And then in the new Congress, there may continue to be opportunities to stop negative legislation. I don't think, I'll give one or two examples of positive things that could happen. In general, standalone bills that are positive are very unlikely to pass in the next couple of years. But there is opportunity to at least lessen the harm here along the border, but in immigrant communities more generally. So that's the backdrop to really keep in mind as we go through the different issues that we're focusing on. I put these issues actually not in order of the talking points, but in order of sort of their relevance and importance, especially when it comes to funding. So the first issue set that you'll see in the talking points is related to the root causes of migration. And there's some details there that I'm not going to repeat up here, but it would emphasize that it's important when you're doing advocacy to be specific, and it doesn't mean you have to be a policy wonk, but at least be specific with a few suggestions of what kinds of aid to Central America and Mexico we want and we don't want. One of the challenges that we're seeing right now is that, it's a challenge and an opportunity. In a very bipartisan sense, people agree that we should change the conditions in countries so that people don't immigrate to the United States. Unfortunately, many senators and representatives and administrative officials have interpreted that as saying we need to fund Central American governments, military or police, or we need to make sure that they're detaining and prosecuting migrants or smugglers. And so very much a completely security-focused approach to Central America. That many people would argue, well, this is helping the root causes of migration. So from our Jesuit partners in Central America, they've, in Honduras and elsewhere, they've shared with us how unhelpful that is to stopping migration. And it's great when we're engaging in advocacy to be somewhat specific about that reality, that dynamic where we want, for example, more investment in anti-corruption efforts instead of in police and military. Again, it doesn't have to be in an enormous amount of detail if you're not as familiar with the dynamics in Central America, but it is good to make that distinction. And then the other information on the slide is just some further examples of what kind of aid we do want, so human rights, judicial systems, sustainable rural development, and then what kind of aid we'd be opposed to. The police and the military who commit human rights abuses, and then also sending money to Mexico to enforce immigration law in Mexico. Because what that does is it then forces migrants to take much more dangerous routes, and that makes them more vulnerable without actually promoting development that helps people stay in their countries instead of migrate. And the one other, for those of you who are a little bit more advanced or familiar with Central America, one other piece to talk about is what are called conditions on aid. So when funding is passed in general, it isn't just money that's sent to different agencies, but oftentimes that money has strings attached. Either it has to be used for a certain cause, or it has to comply with certain human rights requirements. Fortunately, Central American foreign assistance and some small portion of Mexican foreign assistance do have conditions on the aid. And we want to encourage senators and representatives to continue to put conditions on that aid. However, those conditions largely haven't been enforced. And here there's an opportunity, I'll be talking about this in other issues, but essentially in many areas of migration, Congress has designated funds for a particular purpose and with particular conditions, and then the executive branch has ignored that purpose and those conditions. So it's a great chance when you're engaging with congressional offices to point that out and to say, well, Congress can reassert its power as an independent branch of government and become more stringent in some of this enforcement and allocation of money, because wherever Congress people are on the spectrum of as far as immigration, there is a sense that they want their power as Congress to be respected. So that's an underlying message to get across, both in the root causes, and then I'll point it out in a couple of other places. The second area that we're focusing on is border militarization, or rather, promoting a more humane and supportive border rather than just sending more enforcement. So there's a lot of funding opportunities in this area. One would be to not fund new Border Patrol agents. Oftentimes when we advocate against funding for new Border Patrol agents, we do suggest funding officers who are at the ports of entry. that facilitates a lot of the legal back and forth here at the border. I walk through the port of entry a couple times a day, and it's nice for people to not have to wait in line. It helps the economic productivity here in southern Arizona when people can get back and forth through the border. It's also an opportunity for Congress people who want to send money to the border to give them another place to send money to, rather than Border Patrol agents who have a track record of, unfortunately, quite a bit of abuse. Another funding opportunity is to reduce funding to fast-track prosecution. So this gained a lot of attention over the summer in the context of family separation, because fast-track border prosecution was the tool that was used in order to separate families. So they would prosecute the mom or the dad, and that was what then caused the family separation, as it were. And so that official policy of family separation isn't in place, but fast-track border prosecution is expanding. It just expanded to California this summer. The courts are increasing their capacity across the border, and there's been very little attention in Congress to the funding for that particular issue. All of the assistant U.S. attorneys they have to have, all of the court funding that requires. And so this is a good chance for us to bring up that outrage about family separation and point out that the mechanism that created family separation is still in place. And perhaps if we really are that concerned about it, then we should reduce funding to that mechanism. And some of these details are a little bit more technical, and if you have questions afterwards, I'm more than happy to answer them. The final opportunity when it comes to the border is investing in further accountability and complaint mechanisms. So as I mentioned, Congress has an investigative role. So as we're looking towards the new Congress, we could suggest in the new year holding hearings on things like the use of force or a failure to respect our legal obligations towards asylum seekers. So make some suggestions to those you're interacting with, the representatives or senators, about what sorts of issues you want to see them investigating. Again, this isn't legislation, this isn't a bill they need to pass, but it is their power as Congresspeople to investigate administrative agencies. Funding, it always comes back to money. There could be funding for accountability measures that's earmarked in this current debate in the November-December period, as well as a little bit later on. And this is, I think, the only piece of legislation I put in the slideshow. But there is a new body-worn camera bill that was just introduced in the Senate and the House. And what's remarkable about it, first of all, is that it would help increase accountability, bring Border Patrol up to some semblance of policing best practices. But it's also endorsed by the Border Patrol Union. And I would say it's uncommon that Keno Border Initiative and the Border Patrol Union endorse the same piece of legislation. So this is an opportunity to pass some piece of legislation that's maybe a little bit more feasible and has broader support and would ultimately benefit the migrants that we welcome here at the border. Then the third topic is asylum seekers, including children and families. There's been a myriad of policies related to asylum seekers, and again, if you have questions afterwards, I'm happy to talk about them. But I just wanted to point out a few that are important to raise with offices. It's really important that offices realize that there still is family separation of asylum seekers. So there was much more media attention in the summer, and it was much more common in the summer. But not only do some of those children who were separated in the summer remain separated, there's also still new separations under which Customs and Border Protection is either claiming that they can't verify the parental identity, or they're claiming that the parent is putting the child at risk. And there's very little interest or engagement from Congress on these new family separations. And we want to encourage senators and representatives to be questioning DHS, Department of Homeland Security, about how they're making those decisions. Another piece that's critical is to talk about how the executive branch is trying to detain families for longer. It's revising what's called the Flores settlement, which prevents children specifically from being detained for a long period of time. And Congress can't affect what the executive branch decides to do in a policy sense, but again, they don't have to fund as much of it. So they could restrict funding so that it couldn't go to this kind of prolonged detention. And as I mentioned in the root causes piece, especially with what Immigration and Customs Enforcement is doing, they had this certain amount of money that was allocated to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And they've been pulling money from a lot of other sources to fund their operations, especially to detain families and to separate children and to detain other asylum seekers. And so bring that up with your congressional offices, that they had made a decision, they had given Immigration and Customs Enforcement a certain amount of money, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement didn't respect that. So maybe this funding cycle, they should be a little bit more restrictive in the use of those funds and reduce the amount of money that's going to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Another example of that is that the US government has diverted foreign aid from the money that was supposed to go to foreign aid. It's instead now being paid to Mexico to deport people from Mexico. So those are, that kind of moving around of money is a good piece to bring up with the offices. And specifically to talk about how we want to see fewer funds for detaining families, for detaining asylum seekers, for that foreign aid to help other countries deport people. And finally, related to asylum seekers, ask congressional offices to continue to push and to explicitly recognize domestic violence as a grounds for asylum. This is a decision that the Attorney General made in May of this year, is that he decided on an immigration case and said that he overturned the precedent. So the precedent was that domestic violence was, women who were in a domestic violence relationship were eligible for asylum, and he overturned that. But there's been a strong bipartisan response to that decision, and we want to make sure that that's still on the office's radar, that women who have suffered domestic violence continue to be deported to their abusers because of this decision, and Congress needs to take action to ensure that that's incorporated either in the law, or that there isn't, what Congress did this summer is that they said that funds couldn't be used to implement this decision of the Attorney General. So those are a few opportunities to help better protect asylum-seeking women. We also continue to advocate for for people who have provisional immigration status or are legal immigrants in the United States. So it continues to be important to push for protection for people who have deferred action for childhood arrivals. There's not going to be legislation in the next couple of months, but that's a legislative opportunity in the new Congress to pass a bill to protect so-called dreamers, as well as to protect those people who have temporary protected status. So temporary protected status is a status that many individuals who have fled, who in the late 1900s or 1990s and the early 2000s received because of natural disasters in Central America, as well as other countries around the world. And the Trump administration has revoked temporary protected status for almost all of the countries that had it. And there's several pieces of legislation in Congress that would protect those individuals and prevent deportation. And one of the arguments that we make, and that you'll see in the talking points, is that if we deport people back to countries that still haven't recovered, that still can't receive that number of individuals back, then that's just going to cause more migration to the United States. It's going to further destabilize those countries. And then the most recent announcement related to legal immigration is what's called the public charge exclusion, which means that legal immigrants who have received in-kind public benefits, such as food stamps, could soon become ineligible for green cards. So this was an announcement by the Trump administration that then, because of how the administrative process works, they have to post it, and there has to be a comment period. But Congress could also play a strong role in pushing back against this administrative decision. The public charge clause was originally incorporated in congressional legislation in the 90s. So Congress could take it out altogether, but more likely individual members, representatives, and senators could express their concern and through different mechanisms try to influence the extent of the impact of that decision. And then finally, we continue to want to stop the deportation of parents who are living in the United States, so people who have lived in the US for many years and have kids in the country. That here at the Keno Border Initiative, we've seen more than double the number of parents deported compared to previous to the beginning of this administration. And I was just talking to a dad today who was, he had been deported and then he tried to cross the border again because he's just wanted to be back to with his kids, and then he was detained again and deported again, and really in a state where he didn't know what his next steps were. So one way we can't control, Congress can't control what the president chooses as far as the widespread immigration enforcement. But what Congress can do is it could not expand funding, or it could actually reduce funding to immigration and customs enforcement. So if immigration and customs enforcement doesn't have detention space and doesn't have agents, then it's pretty difficult for them to deport people away from their kids. A new Congress, so this isn't likely to happen in November or December, but a new Congress could hold oversight hearings on allegations of misconduct by immigration and customs enforcement, and then also inadequate immigration detention conditions. So raising those issues with the offices can perhaps inspire some movement towards those oversight hearings. A critical one to help stop the deportation of parents is for Congress to continue to stay committed to funding legal orientations for people in detention. So individuals who are going through the through the immigration court process don't have access to a public defender in the way that somebody in a criminal process does. So most people are deported without representation, and that means their only safety valve or their only access to information oftentimes is the legal orientation program that's in detention, that at the very least they get a presentation on their legal rights and can have an orientation, a one-on-one orientation with an attorney. At the end of, in April of this year, Attorney General Sessions tried to cut the legal orientation program, and Congress reacted very strongly and said that this was a program they had funded and they wanted to continue to see that program exist. And we need to make sure that Congress is still ready to fund legal orientations and to defend the program explicitly in appropriation, so that it's not a program that could get cut by the executive branch. And finally, the long-term ask here continues to be a pathway to legal status for individuals with ties to the community and family in the U.S. So in the midst of all of this advocacy that you're doing on the different topics that I named, it's important to remember also that we're trying to communicate what are our Catholic and Jesuit values and how should that influence legislation, even if there's some actions that we can take that will influence legislation in 2 months. And then many of our actions, and the point of the Advocacy Day, is to start to change the narrative in these offices so that maybe a year from now or 2 years from now, they're more likely to vote for positive, humane, and just immigration reform. So continue to stay focused on those long-term asks and don't get discouraged by it, because I think the more that we can reinforce that message, the better, the more effective we can be in the long term with moving the needle on immigration. So just to recap, I'll show you the helpful resources and then I'll recap. So there's some resources that you can take a look at. The American Immigration Council has a lot of just fact sheets and reports. Justice for Immigrants is from the USCCB, the bishops here in the United States. And then there's the IFTJ Immigration Talking Points and Backgrounder, which I imagine many of you have read. I wanted to include there also the Defund Hate Campaign. So Defund Hate Campaign is an effort by many different groups to figure out how we can influence, or to work together to influence the funding process so that things like immigration enforcement and detention are not as funded in this new appropriations bill. So the Detention Watch Network has several resources related to that. And then if you're specifically interested in asylum-seeking families, Women's Refugee Commission is a great source of information, and I've included a couple links to some of their fact sheets as well. You could look, there's more information on their site than what I've included there. So just to recap, we're in a moment, the short-term work that we need to do for immigration is to try to push for helpful funding and prevent harmful funding in this new funding negotiations that'll happen in November and December. And then look forward towards possible opportunities in the new Congress, including pushing for more oversight hearings and continuing to push for positive funding. And finally, keep your eyes on the longer term goals of protecting families and communities in the United States and having a more compassionate and hospitable response to asylum seekers who are arriving at our border. I'm really excited for you to be at Advocacy Day. It's a source of great hope for us here at the border because it allows the voices of the people that we serve here in Nogales to reach DC. So thanks so much for taking the time to prepare, and I think we can move to questions. I think you're muted, Kim.
Yeah. Thanks, Joanna. You covered a lot of ground in 30 minutes. So I know folks were able to take a lot in. Are there any questions that anyone has? As a reminder, you're on mute right now. So if you do have a question, you'll just need to unmute yourself first. If you don't have the ability to call in your question, you can also use the chat function on the screen and I can relay that message for you. Any questions? All right, well, Joanna, thank you for such a thorough presentation, and for folks that are at the teach-in, which I'm assuming everyone on this call will be there, Joanna will also be giving the policy briefing from the main stage, so you'll be able to hear a little bit more from her even the day before we head to the Hill. And just once again, on behalf of Ignatian Solidarity Network, we're thankful for partners like the Keno Border Initiative, and we're thankful for all of you for the preparation that you have undertaken. And we're wishing you all the best in the next few weeks, and hope to see you at the teach-in ready to advocate. So thanks, folks. Take care.